slowly. The Botswana economy has changed its location and its level of relative prosperity to an astonishing amount. And this is particularly impressive, or perhaps heartbreaking, if you compare Botswana to Zambia. Botswana starts here, Zambia starts here, slightly lower life expectancy. On the other hand, perhaps 40% richer than Botswana back in 1958. Botswana sees its level of material prosperity grow enormously. Zambia simply goes on a big loop and winds up pretty much back where it was, with its level of GDP per capita, of material output per capita today, being more or less what it was back in 1958, and its life expectancy also being pretty much the same. That is, there have been improvements in public health in Zambia, but then the AIDS epidemic hits it as well. And this story of Zambia is particularly heartbreaking because they're right smack next to each other. Right, this is Botswana, right smack here in southern Africa, just north of South Africa, just to the southwest of Zimbabwe. This is Zambia, just to the north of Zimbabwe. Their borders actually touch at one small point, just at one small point because, say, this part here, this Caprivi Strip, is actually part of the country of Namibia, and it's part of the country of Namibia because the Germans were colonizing Namibia in the late 19th century and taking it over, and the Germans said, damn it, it's really, really important to us that Namibia be as close as possible to the other German colony of Tanzania on the far side. And the British didn't feel like fighting a war in southern Africa to kind of get rid of the German soldier outpost along this strip. But Botswana and Zambia, both conquered by Britain in the late 19th century, both colonized by the British Empire, both ruled by Britain either directly in the case of Zambia or as a protectorate in the case of Botswana up until the 1960s. Zambia significantly better off economically come 1960 than Botswana was, largely because of the largest industrial sector and the largest copper mining sector in Africa. Zambia, at the end of the 1950s, spoken of as a country that's kind of in the same level as Portugal in terms of its level of economic development, of industrialization, of literacy. Zambia has gone virtually nowhere in half a century. And that gets us to the main topic of the lecture. Why? Or the more bigger question, why is the world as a whole so divergent? Then we can once again pick up a graph from Gapminder and look at the world as it stood back in 1800. When the Industrial Revolution was still just barely taking hold, when you can already see some signs of significant economic growth relative to a pre-industrial agrarian Malthusian past in Britain, smack here, and in Belgium, smack here, and in the United States and in France. But when for most of the rest of the world, its economies are still overwhelmingly pre-industrial. You're still using water and human muscle and animal power for practically everything, maybe a little wind power in places like the Netherlands that have a lot of wind, maybe not. Life expectancies, absolutely awful. Right? Average woman has maybe 9 pregnancies, of which 7 come to term, of which 3 of the babies then die before the age of 5, and so you're raising 4 children from the age of 5 on up to adulthood, and of those 4 children, only 2 survive to reproduce. That kind of life, that's the world in 1800. This is the world today, right? With its leading edge, the United States, being 20 times as wealthy as the United States was back in 1800, with life expectancies for virtually the entire world, except for AIDS-ridden Africa, above 60, but with this enormous spreading out of wealth. A whole bunch of countries in Asia and even in Latin America that really aren't all that much richer than the relatively richest parts of the world were back in 1800, and with a bunch of countries in Africa still not very distinguishable from the levels of prosperity we had back in 1800, and everyone else moving up and spreading out in levels of income per capita and income per worker, kind of concentrating in life expectancy, which is kind of nice. That is, we seem to be very good at keeping ourselves from dying as infants right now, and also keeping ourselves from dying of infectious diseases, that generally we start running into serious trouble in large numbers only when we reach the limits of cell division, as all of our telomeres have worn out, and our next cell division produces something crazy that the body then destroys. That's what tends to happen to us with old age. Otherwise, we're living beyond the Bible's 70 idea of what a full life is. And even countries that are average for the world as a whole, China being average right now, are vastly richer than they were 2 centuries ago. And you can see this process of growth for a bunch of selected countries. But what you see most of all is not just the general growth, but a substantial amount of divergence. Whether the divergence is the form of an Argentina that starts out looking an awful lot like the United States, and yet now is about a quarter as rich as the United States is, maybe a third. It's had a good past 5 years. China, China, which still has an enormous gap, a gap of 5 or 6 in its prosperity vis-a-vis Japan, just across the North China Sea, and then places where things have gone really wrong. Zimbabwe being the most recent such example. When you look at this large kind of combination of growth with spreading out, yeah.
What are the countries there with high income and high life expectancy just to the right of the U.S.?
Green dot. I know the orange dot is going to be Luxembourg. Which largely indicates that Luxembourg is one large money laundering operation. Or actually, it's not a terribly large money laundering operation. It's a relatively small money laundering operation located in the midst of the Ardennes forest bordering on France, Germany, and Belgium. Kind of one... No. Light green. I've actually forgotten what the light green one is. I suspect that number is simply wrong for the light green one. That is... It might be Kuwait. But yeah, if I actually had a working internet connection here, I could find out. So why don't I say we'll find out for next time? So we have this enormous increase in wealth since 1800, and this mammoth increase in spread since 1800. We have countries that stay relatively poor. We have Nigeria's. We have countries that stay relatively rich, like the United States of America. We have Japan's. Countries that used to be relatively poor and that are now extraordinarily rich. We also have Argentina's. That is, if you think about it, Argentina in the mid and late 19th century, it looks an awful lot like Canada. Right? Large grasslands on which you can grow lots of wheat and raise lots of sheep and cattle, abundant natural resources, a native Aboriginal Indian population that's kind of devastated with plagues and reduced to a small shadow of its former self, and so unable to resist any form of European immigration and settlement at all. Argentina back in the 19th century really was thought of as very much another Canada or another Australia, or indeed another Western United States, another California, another Oregon, possibly another Colorado. Come 1914, Buenos Aires, Argentina's capital, is kind of 11th in the world in the fraction of people living in the city who have telephones. Argentina really ought to be up there with the rich countries of the world. It really ought to be up there with Japan and the United States and Luxembourg and Britain and France and all the others, rather than lagging significantly far behind, so that Argentina today is not all that much richer than China, maybe twice the output per capita level, maybe not. And point out that not being twice as rich as China as a whole means that Argentina is poorer than Greater Shanghai right now. Which is extraordinary given that the lower Yangtze Delta in the late 19th century was a place where people were living at an almost subsistence level, while Argentina in the late 19th century was busily investing in telephones, locomotives, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have countries that switch from one to the other. And of those bigger that switch, the most impressive one is China. So let's go back and let's try to take a look at this graph for China being the very large red ball moving itself all over the place, starting here and winding up here, about how much richer has China grown over the past century. Over the past 2 centuries. It's pretty much the same over the past century because in the 19th century, China is pretty much treading water as far as its level of output per capita and labor productivity is concerned. Its population is increasing substantially, and new technologies are being applied. But more people means smaller farm sizes, and smaller farm sizes means poorer peasants, and poorer peasants means lower wages. Yep, we got a plurality at the correct answer, which is D, 20-fold. 20 times richer today than they were back in 1800. That's kind of the right number to have in your mind for both China and the United States over the past 2 centuries, which is interesting because it indicates that they've both done about equally well in relative terms over the past 2 centuries of industrialization, kind of now. So in order to try to explain why it is that countries have wound up where they are, we had our growth model. And our growth model consisted of a simple production function saying that total output Y in the economy as a whole is its capital stock of machines and buildings K raised to this alpha power, this number alpha, times the efficiency of labor E times the labor force L, all of it raised to the 1 minus alpha power, where alpha is this particular number that describes the economy. And why do we assume this simple algebraic relationship between the factors of production, capital, and labor, between the diminishing returns, characteristics of technology alpha, between the efficiency of labor E and the total amount of production Y? Well, we want to have some simple rule because we're economists. And if we're political scientists or sociologists or anthropologists, we're allowed to say that things are really complicated. And anyway, they're different in the South and in the Far West. And you have to study each particular village or perhaps each individual person intensely in order to know anything at all. We're economists. We take the opposite. We say, gee, things are complicated, but you can get somewhere by assuming that everyone's identical and every piece of capital equipment is identical and just looking at the very broad relationships. And this is the simplest way of looking at the broad relationships we can come up with that fits a very few requirements. Those requirements are first that we really want a one-parameter production function. We have our factors of production. We have the level of production that the economy is going to accomplish. We just want one degree of freedom, one number, to describe how different economies are. We could have 2 or 3 or 4 dimensional models. We could say there are 2, 3, or 4 parameters in it. But why not just start at 1 and see if that gets us where we want to go? That would be simplest. If this is a one-parameter model, and if you want to say you have constant returns to scale in labor and capital, then if you double the labor force and double the capital stock, you should double output. And if you want to say that you have diminishing returns to capital, this production function is pretty much the only one you can write down. And it is the only one you can write down if you want your E to actually measure the efficiency of labor. So that the requirement of writing down the simplest rule between resources and production forces you to this particular algebraic production function. And then the simplest other assumptions you can make are that all of the resources in the economy are growing at a constant proportional rate. The constant proportional rate G for how better technology and organization enhance the efficiency of labor, the parameter N for the proportional growth rate of population and the labor force, S for the share of production that you're going to save and invest to add to the capital stock, and this kind of delta number for the depreciation rate on the capital stock for how far the depreciation rate wears out. That's our simple model, right? 3 factors of production, 4 rules about how the rates of growth of these factors of production are very simple. 1 rule for the growth of the efficiency of labor, 1 rule for the growth of the labor force, 2 rules for how depreciation reduces and investment increases the capital stock. That plus the production function give us our model, and that model then gives us our magic equation, which I went through last time through the algebra, which the textbook goes through the algebra in much more detail. It's not at all an obvious piece of algebra, even though it's relatively simple. In fact, this was what Robert Solow of MIT got his Nobel Prize in economic science for figuring out how to construct and use this equation. And this produces the magic equation that you're going to be using for the next week and a half, and that you're going to remember how to use on all of your exams. So I already gave away the answer to this one, but let's see, rapid retention. And then I'm going to want to use the magic equation from growth theory to try to say how much of U.S. economic growth over the past 2 centuries can we attribute to each of these factors. Yep, and once again, we're 20 times. Good retention, at least for 5 minutes. Hopefully it will stick for much longer. What of this 20-fold growth is attributable to which factors or to which changes in the economy? Well, first, let me backtrack a little bit and say that it's really important to neglect that you haven't had this process of continual economic growth of us becoming 20 times as rich, at least along the leading edge of the world's economy, every 2 centuries or so. This hasn't been going on for very long. In fact, this hasn't been going on in the North Atlantic since before 1800. This hasn't been going on in the world since before 1870. That back before 1800 or 1870, well, we couldn't have been getting much richer over time before that. Why not? Because if we were, we'd have been starving to death. England in 1800 was a relatively rich society. Our estimates of GDP per capita put it as 3 times richer than China, say, maybe twice as rich as the world average. As best as we can figure out, in England in 1800, the average person was getting 2,322 calories per day, which is a little bit less than you're getting, but you're getting an awful lot of food where you've sacrificed calories for tastiness and for other nutrients, and you're also working a lot less hard than the average worker in England was working back in 1800, when there was very little steam power, when it was indeed animal power or wind or a little water and human muscles. If you kind of read sociology and history, they talk about the spread of the steam engine throughout England in the second half of the 18th century, in the late 1700s. You shouldn't really believe them. Say, suppose we, well, I don't know, yeah, if we look outside that window, we can see one of the faculty parking lots. If you take 7 of the vehicles parked in that faculty parking lot and add up all of their horsepower, that's the horsepower of all the steam engines in England in 1800. You know, probably insist that none of the cars be a Prius or a Volt. But if you have say 7 SUVs, that's the horsepower of the steam engines in England. 2,300 calories per day, 48 grams of protein per day, that's 2 ounces. You all are getting at least 8 to 10, as best as we can figure out. Probably shouldn't get much more than that, but 8 to 10. Male height of 5'7", we're closer to 5'9". Life expectancy at birth of 38. England, even in 1800, was very poor, arguably significantly poorer than our hunter-gatherer ancestors were 10,000 years ago, or than modern forager societies like the Kung of Botswana and Namibia are today, largely because they don't work as much. There's really only about 6 hours of useful stuff you can do in an average day if you live in the Kalahari Desert. And if you're a forager today, you pretty much have to live someplace in the Kalahari Desert that no farmer wants, because otherwise the farmers will have pushed you out. While the people in England in 1800 were managing to work 8.5 hours a day on average, which is really quite a lot if you consider that England is a far northern country, and so there are a lot of months in the year when it's dark. I think in Scotland, the sun rises at 10 a.m. on December 21st and sets at 2 p.m., and so there's really only 6 hours of daylight total. And before modern artificial light, it's really expensive to try to keep things illuminated after that. So modern economic growth, as we know it, starts in 1800. And indeed, if we go back to Greg Clark's calculations of what the English construction workers hired by monks and guildmasters actually made, we can see that. That is, monks and also guildmasters in towns who had to report to their members how they had spent the guild's money tended to write things down, how much they paid to the construction workers they hired to build buildings. And they also tended to write down how much they paid for staples, like flour and butter and oil and pieces of wood and so forth. We can divide the daily wages of construction workers by an appropriate price index of the cost of necessities, and this is what Greg Clark gets, going back to 1200, for the real wages of construction workers in England. Now, going back toward 1200 or so, these kinds of calculations can go wrong in 2 ways as indicators of how well off a society is. First, you're not at all sure whether the construction workers you're hiring are especially skilled workers who thus get paid more than the average guy, or especially unskilled workers who get paid less than the average. We just don't know. Probably not a big effect, but we don't know. Second, we really don't know whether construction workers are highly paid because you have to pull them out of their farming and craft occupations to get them to come to the monastery and build something. So you have to make it worth their while to come and work, or whether they pay them relatively less than average because they're younger sons, people who are the 4th surviving son of a farm family that had a small farm already. So you tell son number 4 to go and get lost. There's not enough land for you to live on this farm as well. You have to go and find your fortune someplace else. A month later, you're starving to death and begging by the side of the road, and if a monk comes along and says, "Here, I'll pay you a pittance if you come help build a monastery building," you'll jump at it. You really don't know whether these numbers are premium wages for people who have to be pulled out of settled occupations to do this kind of work, or whether they're people who would otherwise be starving to death who are willing to take anything. Those factors can't really affect the number by anything like the difference between 1800 and today. And what we have is before 1800 a long period of time in which human standards of living, even in relatively rich countries, look to have been pretty stagnant. And then this explosion of productivity that has happened since, that's starting in 1800 or so. And at times I play with saying we really should start in 1870 or so rather than in 1800. That is, between 1800 and 1870, you have 2 really big things going right with the world economy, or at least with the world economy in the North Atlantic, in the rich countries of the North Atlantic. And the first is figuring out how to use steam-powered machines to take the fibers of the cotton plant, and to spin the cotton fibers first into thread, and then to weave the cotton fibers into kind of cloth, and to make not just cotton cloth, but with better machines to make woolen cloth as well. That steam-powered